What up, though? This is your humble host, Jamal Baraka. It's been forever and a day, but I'm back. I was inspired to make a video today. I apologize about the echo. I recently moved and I don't have a space set up for sound, so just bear with me for a minute. Um, that's part of the reason why I've cut back on doing videos because my audio has been kind of shitty. But I was inspired today because the story that's been making rounds is that we're probably going to see a black Xavier and a black Magneto in the MCU when the X-Men finally show up. Now, it's been going around for years, over a decade now, that Xavier and Magneto, Eric Lensher, have or were inspired by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Now, a lot of people and a lot of nerds, blurs, or people in the community have taken this as being gospel. I think there was an interview that came out in the 90s where even Stan Lee got in and said, yeah, the Magneto was and Xavier were definitely inspired by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I don't believe this is the case, and I want to get that out of the way up front because I know some people want to take that and run with it. I don't believe that was the case. I've read the first 60 issues of X-Men that came out in the 60s, and if you believe that either character were inspired by Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, I just want to say that you probably need to revisit the source material and then read it again, and then you might draw a different conclusion. Malcolm X is definitely nothing like 1960s Magneto, and I think the only way that you could draw the parallel would be if you were reading Marvel Comics in the 80s. So take that for what it's worth. I invite you to challenge me, but I think if you read Jack Kirby and X-Men of the 60s, Jack Kirby's Stan Lee comics from the 60s, you'll see that that's just not true, and it's very easily provably not true. But I think that if you did cast a POC or Black Malcolm X or Martin Luther King in the MCU, it could actually work, and here's why. Now, if you go by what we have from X-Men First Class, you have Magneto being influenced by Sebastian Shaw and being in an internment camp and being a Jew during the Nazi regime. I mean, just logistically, you can't have Magneto inspired by the Nazi regime. You can't have a Magneto that was in Nazi internment camps and have it make sense. If Magneto was a Holocaust victim, he would be pushing 70, 80, 90 years old right now. So logistically, you can't make that story work. That's why you have Michael Fassbender running around in the X-Men First Class movies, and it just seems weird because he's supposed to be 70, 80, 90 years old, and you're looking at the guy, and it's like, this guy is clearly in his 30s or 40s or whatever. You can't really make him much older than that. But if you push the timeline a little bit further, and then you have a Magneto that grew up in the 60s or the 70s or came up under civil rights era where Jim Crow was a thing, or you had segregation was a thing, and you had him radicalized in the 60s and 70s with the Black Panthers and all that, I could see a Magneto inspired by a black Magneto, or a Magneto that's inspired by Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, or Xavier inspired by Martin Luther King. Even if it's not directly, because black people were dealing with a corrupt government, and you had black people were being systematically murdered by the Klan or corrupt police officers, or the system, the government, were actively working against black people in the 60s and 70s. So I can actually see these characters being radicalized and taking matters into their own hands one way or another. I'm not saying that you could say that Malcolm X would be a direct influence on Magneto, But I'm saying that you could say, well, shit, just looking around what was going on in the 60s and 70s and say that a character like Magneto could be inspired by the government or the actions that were going on at the time. Same with Xavier. You could say Xavier was inspired by Malcolm X. I mean, by Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a pacifist. You could say, well, the MCU version of Xavier was inspired by Martin Luther King. And if you push the timeline and go into it, it's 2019, the characters would still be significantly about the right ages for Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. I mean, it would be the right ages for Magneto and Xavier. So you'd be looking at about a 40-something or 50-something character if he grew up in that era. So I think it's easier to explain why you have a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X influenced Magneto or Xavier now than if you had a Magneto that grew up in Nazi internment camps. It's almost impossible to create a Magneto that has the same origin of X-Men First Class now, because we're so far removed from Nazi Germany at this point. Now, I mean, you could do something like that with Captain America, but because Captain America, his story starts whenever you get him out of the ice. So you could say, well, he was in the ice for however long. You could wake Captain America up right now and say, well, he was in Nazi Germany. He wakes up in 2019, and you have the same origin go on. You can't say Magneto was actually interned in Nazi concentration camps and then all of a sudden he's still alive running around, because Ian McKellen was old as hell when the first X-Men movie came out. So like and Ian McKellen is here now, but Ian McKellen is like 80 years old now. So it's like, okay, you can't really have him playing Magneto unless you just want to go and say Magneto's just old as shit. I would gather that you would not want to have a Magneto that's to the point where he's not a virile man. You still want a man, a capable, younger, older man, if that makes any sense, playing these characters. The same with Xavier. You want Xavier, he doesn't have to necessarily be a Martin Luther King analog, but if he was around in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, we know what was going on back in the 60s, 70s with racism and the civil rights era. He could be influenced by that stuff right now. Matter of fact, if Xavier took up the mantle and said, I wanted to create the X-Men today in 2019, it really wouldn't be an issue today, because this is what we deal with racism right now. With as far as like the shootings that are going on around the country, and you could have a person, the character of Magneto, say no more, hands up, no more. We're not dealing with this anymore. You could have Magneto say, hey, we can try to work within the system. We could have Xavier work within the system to say, hey, I'm going to work with the government so we can try to change the laws to where black people or black mutants don't, where mutants don't have to deal with the government shooting them on sight. Or do you have Magneto say, hey, you know what, we can change the laws in a more militant direction. So even though I don't agree that the characters were directly inspired by the civil rights era, just because there's too much evidence that they really weren't. In the 60s, Magneto was pretty much low-rent Dr. Doom. I mean, they were the same character, except that Magneto had a purple costume and Xavier and Dr. Doom had a green costume with a metal suit. So there wasn't much difference between the characters. I would look forward to seeing the MCU versions of these characters if they are black. I think it's not something to freak out over, because it just logically makes sense. You're either going to get a black Magneto and Xavier, or you're going to get like a LGBT version of these characters. I mean, it's just, you have to stick these characters somewhere in some reality, because these characters are inspired by oppression and striking out against being oppressed. So it's going to be something topical, or something something inspired them by real events that happened in the past. And if you can't use World War II, the next best stage or era would be in the civil rights era. So if these characters were black, I wouldn't panic. I would just say, hey, it's a retcon, but it's a retcon that fits with what we know of history, and I would go for it in that case. Other than that, you would probably have to do a even more serious retcon of the characters. Like, say you have the X-Men come out of a time loop or some weird stuff where their timeline is different from ours, and you still have the same World War II era Magneto and Xavier, and that's just harder to explain. I would rather go for the era where you have these characters exist and it makes logical sense with the rest of the MCU. So this is a rumor. Nothing's been confirmed. You may still get Lily White Xavier, Lily White Magneto, but if it happens, it happens. I wouldn't freak out. You still have the X-Men. It still makes sense where these characters are inspired from. I wouldn't sit out here and say that this is a woke move or get woke, go broke, or no shit like that, because the X-Men have always dealt with oppression and alienation, being different from the rest of society. Black people have caught hell for the last 400 or 500 years in America and throughout the world. So if you see a black Magneto going out there and destroying Sentinels, I don't think that's much different than what you're getting now. It's just, instead of it being he's inspired by Nazis, he's probably going to be inspired by oppression closer to home, which may be uncomfortable for mainstream society to deal with, but this is what black people deal with every day. This is what LGBT people deal with every day, where you're dealing with oppression, not necessarily Nazi Germany, but just walking down the street. So on that note, this is Jamal Baraka, GT Media Reviews. I know this is a different type of video for me because people tend to believe that I'm right-wing or incel or something like that, but really I'm just a black dude from Detroit. I see the same stuff that everybody else sees, and this is just my opinion, and you are entitled to yours. And if you have any opinions or you want to share yours, drop them in the comments below, or you can just respond to my page. I respond back. I don't bite. Hit me up. You can follow me, GT Media Reviews, on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, wherever the hell on social media, or you can hit my website, gtmediareviews.com. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.